Good afternoon. We are Polaris, and we are working to empower people with rare diseases. So the problem is that about 19% of clinical trials are terminated due to low recruitment. And there's also a problem with recruiting vulnerable populations. There is no real easy patient-centric tool for clinical trial information.
Right, so the current websites offered are clinicaltrials.gov, and so these websites are very archaic and they're not very patient-centered. So our solution is a simple patient-centric website with clinical tracking, matching, resources. Doctors would recommend this website as a way to log symptoms, medications, and the mood of the patient. And this is powered by a modern-day React framework, which is hosted by Amazon, so it's very reliable and fast.
Yeah. So we're just gonna click on the link. So yeah, so it's hosted by Amazon, so it's on S3 bucket. So what we have here is our React web framework. So we can do our logins and things like that. But for the sake of the for the sake of the presentation, we're just gonna pretend we're gonna create an account. So the idea is that we enter patient demographics and so and a diagnosis. And they would sort of scroll down and see which one that we want to test on. So we actually had someone come up to us and say that they wanted to look at Hirsch's syndrome, which was hemolytic anemia. So the test that we did was in that. So then after that, we sort of get to this dashboard right here, where we have these 6 sort of resources and features. The 2 main ones that we focused at this hackathon, only because we only had like a 24-hour period, was clinical trials and patient diary. So for patient diary, what we're thinking of is that we're gonna log like a everyday sort of notes about this patient, sort of create this this repository of health information that's totally done by the patient, and it's empowering the patient. And so they can sort of like write notes here, track the medication that they're on, write medication notes as well, and sort of add medication as well, and look at finding nearby pharmacies, why they're taking the medication, and then even tracking like symptoms as well. And then sort of like saving those results and then doing it by like a day-by-day basis, right? And so after that, we would do a clinical trial search.
So the motivation behind using, for a patient to use this is that if they have rare diseases, they want to seek out these potentially life-saving experimental treatments. So Polaris can also find clinical trials based on a number of different search parameters. But just as a proof of concept, we took real clinical trial data from AACT, we parsed it for hemolytic anemia, and we used patient location as our search parameter. So outputting a novel feature that no other existing clinical trial search does. So we pulled from Google APIs, and we wrote a function that can output distance and an estimated time of travel based on a selected mode of transportation. And we can also generate a map of the nearest clinical trial locations. And these modes of transportations are totally modifiable by patients. We can do flights, public transportation, car. Thank you, and we'll take any questions.
So can you talk a little bit about who you think would pay for this and what that would it be like a direct payment? Is insurance involved? What does that look like?
Yeah, so we're actually trying to stay away from sort of like looking at like, yeah. So we want to do like a free patient model, and like a portion of revenue could come from possibly maybe looking at like the medication tracker, and sort of like the everyday daily log of a patient on a certain medication provides useful analytics for certain pharmaceuticals. So that's a possible like revenue stream, but as said before, like doing free subscription models are sort of like the way to go. But yeah, so that's what we're kind of looking at for revenue.
Do you have, sort of any sense of or kind of evidence that patients actually don't find it burdensome to do daily logging, especially if they have to type it in themselves as the user interface? That's not easy if you've got some disability.
So the motivation for a daily logger is that Polaris is targeted for 2 types of patient demographics. One is patients who have been diagnosed and aren't on a clinical trial, and then for patients who are on a clinical trial. So the daily logger basically facilitates the physician, or the patient and the physician, and so that the patient can put down more detailed aspects of their disease so they can find the right clinical trial for that person. So it's more out of aspect of finding the right clinical trial. That's why we would use it.
And then just to more address your question, like UI in healthcare is already a big deal, right? So especially if you look at like things that are for providers and for patients, it's very difficult to navigate around. So providing that easy medication tracker, like easy like sort of symptom tracker, and also using like modern day frameworks is really big. So like even this app itself is like this can be published right now. Like it's not a mock-up, it's a real life web app, right? So what we're trying to show is that it is doable with a very simple and easy UI to do some of these things.
Yeah, how do you know that you can determine where investigational sites are? It seems that on clinicaltrials.gov, it's very variable whether the sponsors are putting in specific locations of clinical trials.
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of that is also dependent, of course, on the operators of the clinical trial. They do have to make that that data public. But surely that's a logistical issue. So here, when we looked up hemolytic anemia, the company, so this is actually a currently ongoing clinical trial. The company was called, I think, like Axion Pharmaceuticals, and they have various locations. I mean, if we were to go back to the map, but they have various locations on the East Coast. There's one in Seattle. So they post all these locations. We can also return important parameters such as in what phase these trials are in, the number of people currently enrolled, you know, the duration of the study, and patients can see all this information and be able to make an informed decision about whether they want to undertake this trial or not.
Yeah, so this database is publicly available that we can hit. So it's not that we're web scraping clinical, like clinicaltrials.gov, right? This is, we are hitting the actual source of information. So it's not that we're going to the website and pulling from there, we're pulling the whole schema. So by schema, I mean like quite literally what, it was like 120 columns or 120 fields, looking at like 15 tables. So this is what we're looking at. Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks.